Eisenhoff. I'm a middle grade author and an elementary school teacher, and I'm much more comfortable in front of a classroom than I am in front of a camera, but we're going to try and make YouTube work for us today. Quite often when I visit a classroom, I like to tell students what my own writing process involves, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. Storyteller. Some people call me a storyteller, and I'm not. A storyteller was someone a long time ago when the tribes would sit around the fires and they'd record their history through oral tradition. I'm a terrible storyteller. I need to build a story. When I was in high school, I used to work for a builder. I built houses in the summer for my summer job, and I think that's a great analogy for how I build a story, because there are a lot of steps involved. It's not an easy thing. The writing process to building a house, the very first thing we need is a blueprint. When you're building a house, you need the blueprint to see what the house is going to look like when you're done, and it gives directions on how to make it, how to get it to look like that. And if you deviate from your blueprint, you might end up with something that does not at all look like what you want. So before I start a novel, the first thing I do is the pre-writing process, and that's sort of like creating a blueprint. Begin the pre-writing process is I consider my audience. Now my audience is going to determine what kind of story I write. It would be very different if I wrote for adults or for children. There are several things that would make it different. The four things that I like to consider most are length. You have to make it appropriate for the readers and for their reading level. That's the next one, is their reading level. The next one would be subject. I probably won't write about Wall Street for a class of kindergartners, and I probably wouldn't write about fairy princesses for an audience of men. And the last one is your main character. It has to be very specific too. For men, I would probably have a man protagonist, and for kids, I could have maybe a unicorn or a puppy or a kid or a mom or somebody that they can relate to much better. But it's going to totally change the course of my story, those four things. Setting gets a little bit of a bum rap. I think people consider it the least important of all the story components, and yet it plays such a vital role. It intertwines with your characters and your plot so closely. You really have to figure out where your story is going to take place before you can figure out the rest of it. It's so important. If you're dystopian, you have to really figure out what kind of government that your place is going to have, and the kind of the oppression that you get there. If it's fantasy, maybe you want to create your own world. You really have to consider what that world's going to be like. Maybe you're going to set it in the real world and add magic or whatever. Perhaps, and I do a lot of this, it's historical fiction. You have to, this one's especially tough because you've got to figure out what life was really like back there. You're in a box that you've kind of got to fit in. If you need your people to go somewhere before there were trains, you can't put them on a train. You've got to do a lot of research. What was it like? What did people wear back then? What did they eat? How did they talk? What slang did they use? What were the world events going on? What were the local events going on in that region or in that country? There's just so much research involved in that, but you've got to get that down or the rest of your book will not seem authentic. The main character is probably the most important story component, because this is where so much of your change is going to be. This is where your audience relates with this main character. And before I ever start my draft, I will sit down with a pencil and paper and I will write and write and write and write about my main character. I want to get them down before I put them into any situations. I'll consider, how old are they? Are they a boy or a girl? What is this person like? What do they like to do? What do they hate? What are their flaws? Do they wear purple all the time? Maybe they chew gum all the time. You have to give them a personality and some quirks before you ever can really figure out how they're going to interact with other characters or other events. I also ask two questions that I want to answer before I start that rough draft to help me figure out my characters. The first one is, what does this person want? That's going to drive my story. It's going to drive my plot later on. And I need to kind of figure out how to get to that point. Whether my character achieves that at the end or not is kind of irrelevant, but I want them to have that drive to get there. The second question I ask is, how will he or she change in the process of getting to that point, to the end of my story? They may start out very shy, and they may end up having figured out how to communicate a little better to people. Or maybe I will have someone who is very angry who may figure out how to deal with that by the end. Or perhaps I have someone who is feeling very lost, and I want them to get a direction by the end of the story. There's so many things that you can do with your character, but it's so important to figure out what you want that character to be like, and to find out their desire, and to find out how you want them to change. The final story element is the plot. And that's just what happens in your book. You're going to take your setting, put your character in it, and have things happen to them. Now, this kind of goes back on your character too. Also, some of the things that you figured out about your main character, especially what do they want. Because you need some conflict in your story plot, that desire of your character will probably play a really strong part in that. What do they want, and how are you as an author going to prevent them from getting it? Every time you put an obstacle in their path, that creates that tension, and the readers will keep on reading because they want to find out what happens. How do they get over that hurdle? How do they get what they want? The second thing is resolution. Once you have conflict, you have to resolve it at the end. You have to answer that question. Will your character get what they want? After they've been striving and striving to get to this point, you need to figure out, do they achieve it or do they not? And if they don't, we have to make sure that we wrap it up in a satisfactory way, so your audience will finish reading your book and say, it's done. Once we have our blueprint finished, we have everything laid out, and we have a plan in order for building our story. The next thing is to start building it. In construction, this is called roughing in. It's when you start slapping together the boards, putting up the walls, putting down the floors, putting up the ceilings. It's usually not very pretty, but it starts to take shape so you can see kind of what your building is going to look like when you're done. That's what a rough draft is. You start putting down all of your story elements. You start putting them together, hammering them out, and you just get them down on paper from one point to another point so you can see that whole course, how you're going to get from one to the other. Rough drafts are not pretty. They're very rough. That's why we call them a rough draft. The next part of the process is the revision process. In building a house, that would be kind of like the finishing work. It's time to add some paint, smooth out the rough spots, lay down the carpeting, add the trim, start to make it look beautiful. That's what you're doing to your rough draft now. You're revising it. You're smoothing out those spots. You're making it look pretty. You're making it work from one end to the other. You're getting it smooth and beautiful so that it's that final product that you want in the end. Something that you can say, oh yeah, I started with this blueprint, I imagined it, now here it is. At that point, your house is probably done, but your story is not. The revision process has only begun. And now it's time to start getting other people involved in it. I like to find beta readers to read my story before I ever send it off to an editor. I'll make it as best I can during my own revision process, and then I will ship it off to my target audience, hopefully. I like to get kids involved, especially classrooms involved, when I write and get their feedback so that I know exactly how kids are thinking about the story meant for kids. I also like to involve other professional writers. They are the ones who, they can catch, well, your typos and stuff like that, but even more, they can tell you, this strand of your story is not really working. You're going to have to go back and work on that a little bit. Or, this part was very inconsistent. If your character is like this, he would not act this way. And so as professional editors and authors that can grab that stuff a little better than the kids that I write for. I think both are very important, however. And I also like to involve family and friends because they're my cheerleaders. And without them, sometimes I might get a little discouraged. They're not worth as much for creating my story and making it better, but they do cheer me on a lot. After I've sent my manuscript out to beta readers, I get it back, I fix any ideas that they had for me, I'll implement whatever I think will make my story better. And then the next thing I do is I ship it off to my editor, and she will go through the whole thing. She's like a super beta reader. She'll help me especially with the typos and with the technicalities, but she also is so good at catching all those inconsistencies and tying up all those strings and just making sure my whole story works. A good editor is priceless. This is the most important person that you're going to involve in your writing process. In school, that may be your peers, it may be your teacher. For me, it's hiring a professional editor, and she's just worth her weight in gold. Well, that's how I build a story. I wish I could have been in your classroom with you today, but this is always fun too. I hope that you guys will visit my website. It's michelleeisenhoff.com. Drop me a line. I love to interact with my readers, with my viewers, and I hope that this presentation has helped you a little bit figure out the steps of the writing process in a way that you'll be able to use for yourself. Happy writing!